Abraham was born in Ur in the Middle East. Basra is probably the nearest modern town. He went with his father up to Haran. That's to the north of what we'd now call Iraq. His father died there, and God spoke to Abram, as he was known then, and said, I want you to go where I tell you, to go to a new place, and I'm going to make you the father of a great nation. Now, Abram probably thought that was a bit funny, because though he was married to Sarai, who later became Sarah, he didn't have any children. And both he and Sarah were fairly old. But Abraham took his wife and his father's household and his nephew Lot, and he journeyed from the north of what's now Iraq across more or less where Damascus is, and then down south into Canaan. And he would have lived in a tent, not like the tents we have nowadays. It would have been a lot of different pieces of fabric stretched out over poles to give quite a big living space. His servants would have had tents of their own, and he had quite a few people with him, because he had cattle and donkeys and camels to help him on his travels. Someone, something, an animal had to carry the baggage. You wouldn't have wanted to carry it all on your back. So Abram went through Canaan. He didn't just stop in Canaan that first time. He went right the way through and on into Egypt, where he met the Pharaoh. And then later he came back from Egypt up back into Canaan, and he wandered around in that area for a while. He never owned any land except one small bit that he bought very late on when Sarah died. But Abram lived in that area, and he'd had this promise from God. And God had repeated the promise. One day you will be the father of a great nation. Your descendants, your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren and great-great-great-grandchildren, when you take them all together, there are going to be so many of them, you won't be able to count them. You'll have run out of fingers. There'll be as many as there are stars in the sky, as many as grains of sand on the ground. There will be that many descendants. But still, Abram didn't have any children. And then, one day, when Abram was camped at a place called Mamre and was sitting under some trees there in the shade, 3 visitors came to his tents, to his campsite. And Abram greeted them as a good person from that area would, and welcomed them warmly. And they said, Abram, we've come to tell you that in 9 months' time your wife will have a baby. Now, Abram was a bit surprised. He shouldn't have been surprised, but he'd been waiting so long. Years and years and years. And Sarah was even more surprised. She was so surprised she laughed. Although later she denied laughing. But Abram, being hospitable, said, will you stay for a meal? And the visitors said yes. So Abram told his wife to get a meal ready and his servants, and they started preparing a meal. Now they started by making bread. If you've ever made bread, you know it takes a long time. Can you imagine waiting for 2-3 hours while the bread was being made? Can you imagine the smell of the bread cooking and hearing your tummy rumble as you waited? But eventually they had their meal. And then the visitors left. And 9 months later, Sarah had a baby boy. Well, story tells us something about God. Because God says things to us. God will make us promises. And even if those promises take a long time, they do come true. Sometimes we like to think that God's saying things to us, that God is saying, I'll do this or I'll do that. Sometimes we just hope that God will do things for us. So things don't always happen just because we want them to. But when God makes a promise to us, then it does happen. And sometimes, after all, one little baby isn't much of a start for a great big nation, a nation of millions of people. But a lot of things have very small beginnings. And when God promises that this will happen, then even though it's just a small beginning, that's the start of a great thing. So, Abram, a wanderer, living in tents, not owning any property, not owning any land. He owned sheep and goats and camels and donkeys and tents, yes, but not any land. But what he had was God's promise. As I said in the booklet, we need to pray and think about people. We talked about being hungry. So we'll pray. Dear God, thank you for all you give us. Thank you that we're not often really hungry. But we know that there are people who are. We've had a lot about meals in the holidays and school meal vouchers. So we know there are people in this country who don't get enough to eat, particularly in school holiday times. And we know there are people in other countries who are hungry because there are locusts, for example, destroying their crops, or because they just don't have enough land, or because it's been too dry because it's not rained. And we ask you to remember those people as we remember them in our prayers. And we say thank you for people who run food banks, or people who protest and make the government change their mind, and for people who help the hungry in other countries. Thank you for them. Amen.